You're probably expecting me to say something very different from what Mr. Levine presented, and you'd be right. I'm going to start by introducing some of the people that are a part of this family and whom you will hear from. You've heard some of their names already, but I think it's helpful if you know the relationships among them. So first we have Collin Griffith. Obviously you are aware of him. He's 17 years old. Catherine, or Kathy as she's known, Kathy Griffith, is Collin's mom. And tragically and sadly, she is no longer with us. Susan Detman is the third main person who is involved in this saga. Susan Detman is Kathy's mom and Collin's grandmother. Christopher Griffith is Collin's older brother, so son of Kathy and of Charles Griffith, who goes by Chuck sometimes. He was born when Kathy was very, very young. She got pregnant when she was 13. She gave birth at 14. Collin came along a few years later. You've already heard about Robert Willantis. He is Kathy's father and Collin's grandfather. You heard that he lives in New Mexico, and he has for many years. He's sort of removed from the family a little bit. Some other names you may hear are Christy Rooney, who is Kathy's older sister, oldest child of Susan and Chuck. John Paul Willantis, who is the younger brother of Kathy, also the child of Susan and Robert Willantis. Susan is now Detman. Finally, there is Nicky Markovich, who is now Susan's husband, and Kevin Markovich, who is the son of Susan and Nicky, so the half-brother of Kathy and the half-uncle to Collin. Okay? I should have drawn a family tree, but at any rate, this family, like a lot of families, at times is very close and at times has its issues. You'll hear about these cruises that multiple family members took together, but you'll also hear about estrangements and fights. The common denominator in the estrangements and fights, Kathy Griffith. She is the person who is periodically, or for really long periods of time, estranged from any number of those people that I have mentioned. You heard that she lived separate from Collin for many years. That was after her divorce from Charles Griffith. With Susan, the other main player, who you'll hear from, it depended not on the year or the month, depended on the day and sometimes even the minute, whether Kathy was communicating with Susan or whether she was telling Susan she never wanted to hear from her again and that she was dead to Susan, or that Susan was dead to her. Susan was a regular part of Kathy's life because she lived in Florida and close in Florida. Susan periodically stayed in Charlotte County. You heard about some of her other homes. She travels quite a bit, some for work, but for a variety of reasons. But she is the constant in Kathy's life. Always there when Kathy needs something, especially money. Some of the things you heard about that Kathy provided for Collin, according to Mr. Levine, were actually provided by Susan. Susan paid for every single trip they took, and that Kathy chose to take. Susan would pay Kathy's phone bill sometimes. At any rate, Susan was the constant. She will tell you about Kathy's personality. She'll tell you about her mental health problems. She'll tell you about Kathy's drinking and misuse of pills. She will tell you about Kathy's threats to commit suicide over the years, but not just threats. She will also tell you about the several attempts Kathy made on her own life. Beyond that, you're going to hear that Kathy not only wanted to cause harm to her own self, but Kathy has threatened or done harm to other people. You'll hear some of those details about some of the things that she actually did to another person in front of Collin, involving weapons. You will hear that she has threatened to kill different people at different times and actually taken steps towards completing that wish. You also hear that Kathy is not exactly reliable in what she says. You'll hear this from her own mother, that she makes things up, that she is unpredictable, she is erratic, and goes into rages. As I said before, Kathy has been, or was still estranged from multiple family members at the time of her death. I won't go into the details now, but you will hear about some of those details as well. So let's go back to September of 2023, now that I've sort of laid the scene. The family went on a cruise in September of 2023. Susan paid for it. It was Susan and Kathy and Collin and Kevin, and I'm not sure if anybody else went or not. Kathy got upset on that cruise. You'll hear that Kathy, according to her own mother, if somebody doesn't do something that she expects them to do, she gets very angry. And in this particular situation, Kevin and his girlfriend was also on the cruise. Were supposed to meet her at 8 o'clock to go to some activity on the cruise. And apparently Kevin and his girlfriend were late, and Kathy got really upset and started saying that they had lied to her and that she was done with them, and she ended up getting her own room for the last night or two of the cruise to be separated from everybody else. You'll hear that as Kathy and Collin were driving home from the cruise, and Kathy's already mad, at least according to Susan, that Kathy was also upset with Collin. You'll hear a variety of things about why she was upset with Collin. You'll hear that she claimed that he was failing a class, and that's why she was mad at him. He wasn't ever failing a class. Every single screenshot on the phone records that show his grades show A's and a B or two. Collin graduated early from high school with college credit. He was not failing. You may hear that Kathy was upset with Collin because he had an appointment set up with, he was dual enrolled too. So he had, high school teachers, but also college professors. She got upset that he said, "Oh, I have an appointment with one of my teachers or professors," and she was mad that she hadn't been told that in advance. There was a disagreement. So either on the way home or when they get home, you'll hear that Collin told this to police later, by the way, that my mom handed me an envelope and said, "Here are all the important papers you'll need if I'm gone." Then they are inside the house, and Kathy got her gun. The gun that she has owned, and lied about whether she had it in her house or not at a variety of times, and pointed it at her son and said that she was going to either shoot him or herself or both. And then she handed the gun to Collin and said, "Just shoot me." She's ordering him around the house. At one point sends him outside and says, "When you hear the pop, you can come back in." Makes him sit down outside her bedroom, cross-legged. When he didn't want to sit cross-legged, she said, "You're going to sit cross-legged," with the gun pointed at him, while she sits on the bed. At some point, Kathy, I guess, decided not to go through with whatever her plan was. And in her erratic and unpredictable way, she put the gun away and drove Collin to school. So Collin goes straight to his teacher and says, "My mom just pulled a gun on me. She threatened to kill me. She threatened to kill herself. I'm scared." So the teacher immediately goes to the school resource officer, and they get the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office involved. Collin repeats to multiple people, his teacher, the SRO, the sheriff's officer, deputy that comes. And they did send someone to Kathy's house because they were doing this investigation, and Kathy won't open the door. She didn't want to speak to the officers. Eventually, they convinced her to speak with them. She said she'd had bad experiences with law enforcement in the past. She finally says, "That never happened. Collin's just making it up because he's upset that he was failing a class, and I took away his phone and his AirPods because he's failing a class." Okay, so divergent stories, right? Sheriff's deputies go back to Collin at the school and say, "Your mom says this never happened. She says you're just mad at her and made the whole thing up." And Collin is like, "No, it happened. This is what she did to me. She has a gun in the house." They didn't believe him. They believed Kathy. So, when he repeats, now to DCF staff members who are investigating, and he tells all of these details too, and the DCF worker has access to all of the prior DCF reports that exist from Florida that uniformly talk about Kathy being violent with others, Kathy not being protective of her children, Kathy threatening to or committing violence on other people. Despite all that, they believed Kathy. Collin repeated again and again I am scared to be with my mom. If she does something to me again, like pull a gun on me, if she attacks me, I will defend myself, and I may hurt her. So they put Collin in a Baker Act facility for those statements. Interestingly, Kathy, rather than being relieved that her son, who allegedly threatened to kill her, is in a safe place, does everything she can to not cooperate with the people in the Baker Act facility, the sheriff's deputies, DCF. They insist, because of what happened in Oklahoma, and because of what he said his mom had done to him, and because he said, I don't feel safe going home because I'm afraid of what she might do to me again and what I will do in response, that he was safest in this facility. Kathy won't sign medical release forms so they can get more information about the family. She won't approve any medication for Collin. And then she hires a lawyer to get him released from the facility against all advice. When they were getting ready to release him to Kathy, he says, do not send me home with my mom. I am scared. She threatened me. If she comes at me, I'm going to defend myself. So they put him back in the Baker Act facility. By the way, they find out she does have a gun. Like, she owns the gun. Collin tells DCF, I would rather go into foster care than go back with my mom. Because he didn't feel safe with her. Eventually, after you heard about the special unit from Charlotte County Sheriff's Office that got involved with the family, this is when they get involved. And you'll hear about either Corporal or Detective Rentis, he's a male, and Detective Lacey Zanoniani. A lot of times she's referred to as Lacey, or Detective Z. But they start getting involved with the family. They're making suggestions to Kathy about how to handle this situation, and she is fighting against them in any way she can. She eventually Kathy tells Detective Zanoniani that Collin is going to this place called Sandy Pines, and he's going to be there from between 60 and 90 days. They're going to work on a treatment plan for the trauma he has suffered, for the statements he's made. But after 3 days, Kathy checks him out of Sandy Pines against medical advice. There's a family meeting where Kathy admits to pulling a gun on Collin. But everybody in the family says, nope, Collin's going home with Mom, because Mom was insisting on it. It's her way or the highway. So that happened in September of 2023. Next you'll hear is about the November 2023 incident where Collin ended up getting arrested. What you'll hear is, once again, diverging stories about what happened. On November 12th of 2023, Collin called the sheriff's office. He may have even called Corporal Rentis. Okay, so he is reaching out. He is being forthcoming. He says, my mom and I had a verbal argument. I left the house because I'm scared. She told me that I should just pack my bags and go. But then you'll hear this happens over and over. It's a theme. She will kick him out, but then she'll claim he's a runaway and he must come back. Inconsistent. So he called Rentis and says, I don't feel safe at home because my mom still has her gun and because she's threatened me before and now we're fighting or arguing. That night, on November 12th, the deputies decide that it's best if Collin go with Susan, his grandmother, be separate from his mom, which I think you'll hear from the sheriff's deputies is kind of what they think would be best for everyone, is to just not have Collin and his mom living together. But Kathy is insistent that he continue to live with her, despite her knowing what he has said. And remember, he has said, if she attacks me, I will defend myself. If she threatens me, I'm afraid of what might happen. So, Susan picks Collin up on November 12th. She brings him to Auburndale, which is she teaches, and her in-person teaching job is here in Polk County. So that is her main residence, is Polk County. But that's a 55 and older community. You're not supposed to have kids there for very long. You've got Kathy yelling, demanding that Susan bring her son back. You can't steal him from me, even though this is a resolution to the argument that Collin and Kathy had, and that Collin is saying he doesn't feel safe with his mom. At any rate, next day, Susan, who is a trooper, brings Collin back to his mom. Best decision? Probably not, but I don't think you can ever know what other people are going through when you're not going through it yourself. So she brings him back to Kathy, and they're all together in the home. And Susan will tell you quite honestly that she doesn't remember if it was this day or another day, because there were many days like this where she took Collin, and then Kathy insisted she bring him back, and then Kathy would go on a tirade against Collin when he came back. It may have happened this day, it may have happened another day, but Susan will tell you that Kathy punished Collin, because even though sheriff's deputies had mediated this, Susan's going to take him for the night, let everybody cool down, that when Kathy started insisting that Collin come back to her, and he's 16, doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't have a car at this point, and he's with his grandmother. And apparently grandmother, Susan, didn't bring him back quickly enough to Kathy's liking, but Kathy punishes Collin. Susan will tell you she saw Kathy make him do a whole bunch of push-ups and holding weights above his head, and then she whipped him with a belt in front of Susan. And Susan said, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's going too far. And Kathy says, no, it's not, because Corporal Rentis said I can discipline him any way I want. Which isn't true, by the way. But so Susan, the walking on eggshells that she has done for years with Kathy, can't do much about it, she feels. Later that same day as they're eating, Kathy is, these are Susan's word, reading Collin the Riot Act about this is how it's going to be. This is what you're going to do. You have to listen to everything I say because Corporal Rentis says it's okay. Susan thought she was being way too harsh. And I realize parents differ in how they treat kids. That's fine. And Collin did stand up and say, let's just do this. Now, Collin told the police, because they did get involved, and this is when he got arrested, that his mom kept telling him to shut up, and he wouldn't shut up. And you'll see some examples of that on the Ring video. Collin would talk back. Best decision? Obviously not. But he says that when he wouldn't shut up, his mom hit him in the face, punched him in the face. So he grabbed her and did a wrestling move where he basically flung her to the ground. He fully admits that. He says that while he was doing that, he kneed her in the stomach. Okay? He never denied doing that. At any rate, Susan says when he stood up and said, let's do this, she went to get her phone to call Rentis to try and mediate, and next thing she knew, they were both on the ground. She didn't see Kathy punch him, but she also said it's entirely possible it happened, based on her knowledge of her daughter and how she behaves. So, after she's on the ground, they're both on the ground, Collin gets up and leaves the house. Calls the police. That's how the police get involved. Collin called them. And you'll see some of the body-worn camera footage from that night, with Collin talking to the officers, being very forthcoming. The officers spent a lot of time talking to all three people. Collin ends up getting arrested for domestic violence battery. Kathy denies she ever put her hands on him. He is put in jail that night, and the next morning, when he's getting ready to be released from the juvenile detention center, they say, okay, get in the car with your mom, because mom's there to pick him up. And Collin says, don't make me get in the car with her. If she attacks me, I'm afraid of what will happen. If she comes at me again, I'm going to defend myself. The law enforcement officer at the juvenile jail basically says, I don't like your attitude, get in the car with your mom. So Collin gets in the car with his mom, goes home, and she immediately starts making him do standing marches with weights above his head. And you'll see that on body-worn camera footage, because while the personnel at the jail forced Collin to get in the car with his mom, even though he said he didn't feel safe with her, they did call the sheriff's office and say, by the way, I had a kid that said he might kill his mom, which is not what happened. Well, I wasn't concerned enough about it to not let him get in the car with his mom, but I'm calling you. Can you guys go check? So all these sheriff's deputies troop up to the house. Kathy opens the door, come in, and you see Collin doing this with weights above his head, and the officers separate them and speak with each one. Kathy's saying, he beat the shit out of me last night. This is his form of discipline. He's been doing it since he got home from the jail. Collin is outside talking to the detectives, once again, being very forthcoming. He says, my mom thinks I'm going to hurt her, or that I want to hurt her. I don't want to hurt her, but if she comes at me, I'm going to defend myself. Guess what happened that day? Collin gets Baker acted again. So, Collin's back in a psychiatric facility for the statements that he made about, I don't feel safe with my mom. If she comes at me, I'm afraid I'll do her harm. Meanwhile, Kathy is calling Corporal Rentis and Detective Zanoniani, all upset that Collin got taken away from her. And then she starts making suicidal statements to them. So they send other deputies to the house, and Kathy gets Baker acted for threatening suicide. So, all is not well at home, clearly. After Collin was arrested for domestic violence battery, Susan, his grandmother, hired him a lawyer named Jeff Rapkin down in Charlotte County to represent him in those criminal charges. Kathy is back and forth about what she wants to happen. Sometimes she wants the charges dropped. Sometimes she wants Collin to get diversion. Sometimes she wants him to, get the book thrown at him. Jeff Rapkin realizes that this is not a good situation. So he crafted what's called a 751 agreement. And this is an agreement between Kathy and Susan that allows for concurrent custody of Collin. And you'll see the legal paperwork. It was signed and notarized by Kathy and Susan and Mr. Rapkin. It was filed with the courts. The court ordered this concurrent custody agreement, meaning that Collin could be with either Susan or Kathy. Each one of them could make medical decisions for him. Each one of them could enroll him in school, that they had equal authority over Collin. And the idea was to kind of give everybody a break and respite. Kathy sometimes misinterprets that concurrent custody agreement. You'll see in some of her text messages or hear her on Ring video leaving messages for other people or talking to them. The agreement says that you can only have him if I'm mentally incapable of taking care of him or if I'm physically incapacitated, which is not true. You'll see the paperwork. At any rate, she has this very ambivalent, is a very tame term, very ambivalent feelings about whether Collin should be with her or not with her. And over the next few months, so December 2023 into the first few months of 2024, there is a lot of back and forth, meaning Collin goes between Susan and his mom. Meanwhile, he's still going to school and everything and keeping up his grades. You'll hear from Susan that Kathy would alternately kick him out again, say, "Get out of here, I don't want you here anymore," and then demand that he come back, even when he didn't want to. Several calls over the months from a variety of people, from Susan, from other family members, from Jeff Rapkin, saying that Kathy is suicidal. She has a gun in the house. She's threatened to kill herself. She actually does overdose a time or two. So that's what's going on in those months. In February, and it's going to be unclear exactly how all this occurs, but DCF gets involved again. Collin repeats that he doesn't feel safe at home with his mother. This is, after the multiple suicide attempts and Baker acts for Kathy. He tells them, "I'd rather be in DCF custody. I'd rather be in foster care. I'd rather be anywhere but at home with Mom. I'm scared." DCF wants him to live full-time with Susan. Kathy will not have it. Detective Zanoniani is saying, all these people have intervened and tried to come up with a solution. Kathy will not have it. Somehow, Collin ends up back with Mom, but because he doesn't feel safe, he runs away again, telling everybody, "I don't feel safe." Law enforcement gets involved again. They find a gun in the home, which Kathy had lied to them about and said, "Oh no, I gave it to somebody else for safekeeping." Oh no, there's a gun there. She also claims that Collin attacked her again to law enforcement. She said, "He was trying to run away and he battered me." So the sheriff's deputies look at her Ring video and they're like, there was no battery. She tried to step in front of him and block him from leaving, escaping the situation, and may have brushed by her. That's what she was calling a battery and trying to get him arrested. But then she would have probably demanded that he come back home with her. Needless to say, much chaos. In March, in what I hope is a little bit of positive news in all of this, Collin gets his driver's license, and he gets a job at Domino's. And he did get a car. Kathy didn't buy him the car like she wants everybody to believe. It came from a trust that existed separate from Kathy. He's still going back and forth between Susan and Kathy, managing to accomplish things as a 17-year-old, 16, then 17-year-old. And then we get to the end of August, beginning of September of 2024. And you'll see a text from Kathy in the end of August saying to her mom and to other people, "I'm going into that dark place again. My therapist thinks I should go to a facility for at least a few days," but she doesn't. September 7th, you heard about the whole bookshelf thing. There was, in fact, an argument over whether Collin would help her put up a bookshelf. And he is not being entirely respectful to her when he says, "It'll take too long, I have to go to work." Also, there aren't studs on that wall. If we put it up there, it's going to fall and it's probably going to hurt someone. So did he help her put up the bookshelf? Absolutely not. Should he have? Maybe. But he didn't. And this is Kathy's reaction, and you will hear her words and see her. "Get out and don't come back. Even if you're bawling your eyes out. And give me the keys to the house." So Collin's gathering things. He goes out the door. You may or may not see her opening the door and then closing it and locking it with his keys to the locked house inside. So Collin, being kicked out again, calls Susan, who is a concurrent guardian. By the way, Collin had been put on probation for the domestic violence battery, and his probation officer's name is Monique. You'll hear about her. And the court had said that even though most of the time you're not allowed to go out of the county when you're on probation unless you're with a parent, it's okay for Collin to go visit his grandmother in another county. Just got to let Monique know. Okay? So Collin emails Monique, says, "I'm going to my grandmother's." Called his grandmother, said, "Mom kicked me out. Can I go to your house?" She said, "Sure." She says, "I'm in the Keys right now, but I'll be there tomorrow." Okay, so it wasn't like he was secretly going to this place where he can have a rager. This is something that has happened multiple times. So he drives to Polk County, and you'll hear from the neighbors that his car got there on Saturday and did not move. So, meanwhile, Kathy is getting worked up, to say the least, angry. I think one detective may describe her as manic. She starts in the early morning hours of Sunday the 8th making repeated calls to Susan and to Collin, and will beg, plead, yell, cuss, call people names. She calls her mom a fucking moron. She is all over the place, insisting that Collin come back home. But at the same time, she'd say, I reported the car stolen because the car is not in your name, it's in both our names, and you're not allowed to drive that car. But you better get in that car and come right back home. But wait, I took money out of your bank account so you can't even afford to put gas in it, but you better come back home. Get in that car and come back home. I'm going to sell the car. I sold the car. I'm already up in Auburndale. I found a buyer whose aunt lives in that community and who gave me the gate code so I could come into the neighborhood in Auburndale, and I couldn't see the car at Susan's house. You're in big trouble because I already sold that car. She was nowhere near Auburndale. You'll see the Ring video. She was at her home. But she made up this elaborate story about having gone to Auburndale, gotten the gate code from the buyer's aunt, and going in and not seeing the car when the neighbors were like, the car never left. She is doing everything she can to get Collin to come home. She calls law enforcement, Detective Zanoniani and Corporal Rentis. There's no secret that Collin is in Auburndale and that his grandmother has okayed it. It's okay with his probation officer. Everybody tells Kathy, let him stay in Auburndale. Let him stay in Auburndale. Let him stay in Auburndale. Kathy claims on one of her phone calls that the police gave her 24 hours of Collin being gone until she was going to get in trouble for him being a runaway. No. You'll read her texts, you'll listen to her messages. Despite everyone telling her, let Collin stay in Auburndale, she wasn't having it. She was the one who was angry. You'll hear Collin's voice when she says, are you coming home or not? No. Which is what law enforcement, Susan, everybody recommended, is that he don't go home. She went to him. She went to where he was safe. And the neighbors that you heard about will tell you that she came in hot and angry, that she sped into this quiet 55 and older community, whipped her car into the driveway, whipped it back out, pulled in front of the house, got out, slammed the door, and marched up to the carport door. Collin was never in the yard where her earbud was. She went up to the house and went in the house, angry. Within a few minutes, Kathy comes back out of the house, unlocks Collin's car, and starts throwing all of his stuff into it. And then after she's done throwing his stuff into it, you'll hear the neighbors say that she was yelling and shaking her fist, and it looked like she was the one who was being aggressive, and that Collin was standing in the doorway. So there's a door that goes into the living room and out to the carport, and that he was standing in the doorway. And when she comes up and you'll hear varying terms. You'll hear that he put his hand on her shoulder by where her ponytail was and kind of brought her inside. I don't know that you'll hear a neighbor say that he dragged her from the yard by her ponytail, by her hair. They will say that they heard her yelling. You can evaluate whether you think Collin was doing anything at that point to harm her. That's going to be part of your decision. Or if you think he was trying to avoid her making a scene in the community where teenagers aren't supposed to be living, you'll hear from the neighbors that they had seen Collin there before. He was never a problem. He would visit Susan because, like I said, he went back and forth, but they had never seen Kathy there before, ever. So, Kathy and Collin go back into the house, and it's about an hour later that Collin calls 911, crying, upset, saying, "We got in a long fight. My mother's bleeding out. Please send someone right away." The 911 operator explains how to do CPR, tells him to move her, to lay her on her back, to be able to do CPR. You'll hear him doing CPR on her while counting with the 911 operator. And intermittently he'll say, "Just send someone, she's not bleeding anymore." And when first responders get there, she was already dead. What you're going to have to decide at the end of all this and by the way, Collin has wounds too, is whether the state has proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that what they claim happened, that Collin somehow planned this, he's been plotting it for months, that he murdered and dragged his mom into the house that she went to, where he was safe, to kill her, or whether what Collin had been saying he was afraid would happen, and that had happened in the past, actually was what occurred. That his mom came to him, went into the house where he was safe, and attacked him, and he had to defend himself. And that he is not guilty of the murder or the kidnapping of his mother.
Thank you, Ms. Thornhill.